let's do a deep dive to find out whether in a competitive market, should the government intervene and put in tariffs, or should they introduce quota? And which one is better? Remember, there might be a competitive situation where your country is producing goods at a much higher cost than what the world will provide you for the same good. They might provide you at a much lower cost. There is a big implication to this, meaning those industries that are producing at a higher cost in your country, they will not be competitive because the world will start to, in a free market situation, will start to export to your country and your industries will go out of business. So let's look into it as to which one should the government do to restrict this unnecessary imports so that the industry locally can thrive, consumers are better off, producers are better off. So the way we do this is by looking at demand and supply. And so what we first do is look at price and quantity. Yeah, and we plot the demand curve. And we plot the supply curve. So you will get the equilibrium price, the market clearing price, the market clearing quantity. Let's say Q0, P0. So this, let's say, is your country. And there is this industry with this dynamic that your country has, that is a market clearing price P0 and a quantity Q0. But now let's imagine that the world price, and let's make this $10, right? And let's make it even more concrete. Let's say this is the wheat industry. Yeah. So in the United States, it costs you $10 as the market clearing price, and certain quantity, let's say 20 tons of quantity, right? So this is price per pound, let's say, and this is quantity in tons, let's say. Yeah? Quantity that goes at that price. It's just hypothetical numbers. Yeah. So let's say in the United States, $10 is what it costs per pound, and at that price, your industry in the United States can provide 20 tons of quantity of wheat. So that's your equilibrium, that's your clearing price. But now let's imagine the world can produce wheat at a much lower price. Let's call this P world. And so the P world here is, let's say, $7. And in this case, as we said, P world is $7, P for United States is $10. So what happens? When you start to see that the world can provide you something cheaper, what will happen? And let's say United States is free, open economy, and it's open to imports. So then what will happen? There will be imports. Your price of United States that is higher than $7, those goods won't be sold at that price. Meaning there will be a price pressure for this price to go down, and there will be a quantity pressure for this quantity in the United States to go down. Yeah? But before that, let's analyze, before we look at the world situation, what was the producer surplus? You know, we have consumer surplus in blue and producer surplus in red. What was the producer surplus before we introduced this world price? Yeah. So we would mark this as the consumer surplus. Yeah. Yeah. This is the surplus that the consumer is enjoying. We've covered this in the previous video, but this is the consumer surplus before, and this would be your producer surplus, right? Because that's your clearing price. Yeah. So this is what the situation was before we introduced this world price. Yeah. So at this clearing price, whatever is above the clearing price is your consumer surplus. Whatever is below is your producer surplus. So let's say this is producer surplus, and this is consumer surplus. Yeah. So this is what the situation was. You see the area of this triangle? That's what your consumers were better off with that. With this world price being much lower and the United States open to imports, what will happen is this will now become the maximum price at which the United States consumer will buy from United States industry. Because what will happen is they realize, oh, I can get QS, locally supplied items at a cheaper price from the United States. So they'll continue to buy this from the United States, but then they'll start to import all of these prices until their demand is met. And so what will happen is they will go from Q0 imports to QD imports. Yeah. So let's call it Q world. Yeah, so Q world. And this is QD, let's say domestic, yeah, or United States. So the United States Q0 shifted to the left because now all of a sudden your clearing price is much lower, and that other suppliers are willing to provide much higher quantity at the world clearing price, and so this becomes now your new normal. Yeah, so the demand shift would increase from Q0 to Q world. So what we saw is quantity increased, price decreased for the United States. Yeah, so far with me? So the quantity decreased, and so this would be the world situation, meaning in this case, what would be your producer surplus and what would be your consumer surplus? This, which was the producer surplus, is no longer the producer surplus, this area here, right? Because now it's going to be transferred to consumers, because producers are no longer able to charge this higher price. So this becomes part of the blue area. So the producer surplus got transferred to consumer surplus. You see the shift? And consumers were also able to get these two because they're able to get all of this quantity at a lower price. So the consumer surplus got even more higher with this area. So the producer surplus reduced drastically, and consumer surplus increased drastically. Yeah. So we saw producer surplus. If you had an open economy like the United States, this would be the equilibrium. Meaning this is what the consumers would assume to be default. All of this thing under blue is your consumer surplus, and all of this items in red would be your producer surplus. Yeah. So this is going to be normal, meaning this is what your producers are going to be happy with and consumers are going to be happy with. So when the government realizes this, saying, hey, I can only sell this QD, which is much smaller quantity than Q0, then they realize, oh, some of these industries are now out of business, because all of these suppliers that were supplying at all of these higher prices between 7 and 10, they went out of business. So they shut shop. So what does the government do? They say, hey, I'm going to introduce either a tariff, which is basically saying, hey, anything that's imported from outside will cost higher. And that by that, it also means that locally, the producers now will be able to charge a higher price. Or it could have a restriction on imports, not just by tariffs, but also by quota, saying, hey, you can only import 10 units, or 10 tons, let's say. of wheat. So assuming this to be the equilibrium, now if the government introduces tariffs and says, hey, I want to introduce tariffs and I want to do it such that there's zero imports. So let's say that's the first intervention the government does. And by zero imports, it says zero quota, right? Meaning I have no quota for imports, zero imports. Zero imports happen at what point? At the original clearing price. So demand and supply would meet here. And so government would then shift this dynamic to say, hey, I'm going to increase the price from $7. The price would go up from $7 to $10 as government wants to reduce zero imports. This is the import originally. And government says, hey, no, zero imports, meaning only locally supplied items can be demanded and consumed by the consumer. In that case, we will have to use the market clearing price as of what we saw earlier. So then what happens is, now all of a sudden, the consumer surplus, the blue, is going to be shifted back. You see? Now we'll have the same demand and supply, but then the blue got shifted back to the blue surplus, the trapezoid that we had here, is now shifted back to the producer. So this industry that was able to supply at this higher price is now again back in business. So what did we see here? We saw that the producers gained this area of this new area back, yeah? By adding a tariff of, let's say, $3 per unit, the government got the price to go back up to $10, but then they also reduced the quantity from Q1 to Q0, back again, yeah? So the price went to P0, quantity went to Q0, imports went down to 0, because this is going to be substituted by US producers, and this consumers are going to go out of not consuming. So what happened is producers gained, consumers lost, yeah? Consumers just lost what producers gained, and consumers lost much more, right? They also lost this area, which was before in blue. They lost that as well. So consumers lost B and C as well. So consumers now all of a sudden can only demand at this quantity or whatever, and they have to pay a much higher price. So consumers lost B and C and A, producers got A, and that, if you add both of this up, we get the dead weight of minus B and minus C. Yeah? So adding zero import restriction and adding zero import policy got the price to go back up, quantity to reduce, but there is a loss overall, B and C, from consumers, because they are no longer, this B is, these consumers are no longer, they have to pay a higher price, right? They have to pay this higher price than what it was before, and these consumers are out of business. So these are substituted by, this quantity substituted back by US production, and this actually goes out of imports. So you see what was the change in consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the net dead weight that this policy cost, zero imports. So we saw how producers gained and consumers lost, but this whole thing can be redone in such a way that it introduces tariffs to say, hey, in this case we had a $3 tariff that actually got imports down to 0. So government didn't make any money, right? Because if there's a tariff of $3 per unit, then you gotta have some import to make money out of that $3. So if you have 1 unit imported, then the government makes $3, let's say, right? For all of those items that are imported. But in this case, there is like 0 imports, because B items, this quantity is now provided by the US government, by the US industry, and this is substituted away to mean these consumers went away. So if we had to redraw this to say, hey, I'm going to introduce some amount of tariff alone that doesn't get to zero imports, because then government makes no money, and there's just this deadweight loss, how would we redraw this? Well, we could redraw this as follows. So now we're going to redraw this to talk about a general case where instead of adding that $3 tariff, which gets import down to zero and government makes no money, we're going to add a small tariff, and to see how is tariff better or quota is better. Yeah. So assume demand and supply, and we have the market clearing price P0 and Q0. Now assume that the world price is here. Yeah. So initially in our example, we had this to be $10, and here we had $7. Yeah. So now assume that the government adds $1 tariff, meaning it just says, hey, I'm going to charge $1 for every unit that's imported. Yeah. So then the price becomes, P tariff becomes $8. So what would that look like? This would be the world price. This would be the price with tariffs. So here, what we see is, with this $1 tariff, we are starting to see quantity. There's an increase in price from 7 to 8 because someone has to pay that $1 of tariff, and we see that the quantity also reduced. So this was for Q world, and then this is Q tariff. Yeah. So the quantity goes here. Yeah. So what we see is that originally, with this tariff now added, let's draw the consumer surplus first. So the consumer surplus originally without the tariff was this, yeah, it had the word in it. And then we had the producer surplus to be this, yeah, as in the previous diagram. And with this tariff added, this trapezoid moves from consumer surplus to producer surplus. Yeah, so let's call it A. So now we see producer surplus is plus A. And we also see the consumer surplus, like in the previous one, minus A. Yeah, we see this reduction. But also, remember, this was all part of consumer surplus, yeah, before. Because it was the world price, this whole thing was part of consumer surplus. But now because of the tariff got added, this part was moved to the producer. This was also going to be taken away. This whole thing will be taken away from the consumers. So let's redraw that. So consumers lost this whole area, which is this guy. Let's so consumers lost B and C. Yeah? Consumers lost B and C, and then they also lost this D area. This B is this triangle here, C is this triangle here, and D is this rectangle here. So what was the change to consumers? Consumers lost minus A, which was this. They also lost this whole thing, which is minus B, minus C, minus D. Yeah? But then the government would make up this revenue, because they're going to make $1, which is the height of this rectangle, times this quantity, right? So government makes up D actually. So it is government will be plus D in revenue. Yeah. So what we see is the net surplus. What is the net surplus here to the consumers? It's still so net welfare. Net welfare here would be producer surplus plus consumer surplus plus government. So it'll be plus A minus B minus C minus D plus D. So we see this cancel out. So we see the net welfare is the same as before. Yeah, minus B minus C is the dead weight, but the government at least earned the D income through tariffs. Added $1 tariff, government made up and captured back this rectangle. But if government had just said, hey, I'm going to have a quota restriction based on this limit, it would have said, hey, quota is restricted by Q world minus Q tariff, and let's say this was some 10 units. If they would have done this and had a quota restriction, this triangle, this rectangle would be profits for the producers of the world outside, meaning the US government would have lost this profit of this rectangle to those exporters outside the US. So this will be exported as profits outside to those countries, except rather than government actually capturing that profit. So the dead weight would have been minus B minus C minus D with quota, whereas it's just minus B minus C with tariffs. So tariffs are indeed better for the government rather than this artificial quota that also gets the same reduction in surplus, but the dead weight is much higher, so the surplus reduction is much higher to the government overall, to the country overall. So this helps us understand whether tariffs is better or quota is better. And the answer is tariffs is way better because you can capture back this rectangle D that you would have lost to your foreigners who are producing that supply to you. Right? Thanks.